Let us pray. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth, may the meditations of our hearts, our minds, our very spirits, may these be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, David says, may my heart be knit to yours. Everyone knits, but not all use yarn. Everyone, knowing it or not, knits together the very fabric of community, the fabric of friendship, of family, of communities of faith. And Jesus did the same. Jesus knit with threads of care and welcome and concern. And as he did, he created a mantle of hope and healing in this world. And therefore, since we are all knitters, and according to Psalm 139, God too is a knitter, for he knit us in our mother's womb. Today we look to knitting as a guide for our faith and for the spiritual lessons knitting can teach us. For example, knitting, like a life of faith itself, it's not hard. It's not hard to learn how to knit, but neither is it easy. It is easy to learn the basics of each knitting and faith. Knit one, perhaps, purl one. Love your neighbor as yourself. Forgive as you wish to be forgiven. Do not judge lest you yourself be judged. It's easy to learn, but actually doing these lessons, repeating them often, finding the time, finding the patience, the courage to do them over and over consistently for long periods of time, so that those very small acts build up upon one another to create something of real substance, something which is beautiful, something that provides warmth and comfort, something that offers healing, something that spreads love. Well, that is quite difficult. And yet, that is exactly what the Church by the Sea Knitting Group has done. And some of them may even be knitting right now in the pews next to you, creating that healing in our midst. Well, over the last 7 years, that knitting group, some spiritual lessons have emerged, and we want to share those with you this morning. So here we go. Lesson number 1. The yarn does not yet know its greatness. It does not yet know, that yarn, what it will become through the loving hands of the knitter. Nor does the yarn know how exactly it will bring warmth and comfort and healing. Maybe it'll be a scarf, maybe a shawl, maybe socks, maybe a hat. It does not yet know. And neither do we. We do not yet know how we will serve, how we will bring warmth, comfort, and healing. Because God has not yet finished knitting us. And so our job, like the yarns, is to trust the knitter, to surrender, to allow ourselves to be used, to be shaped. Ours is not to question the pattern, which at any given moment, at any given stitch, from our very specific viewpoint is yet incomprehensible. It is only in retrospect that the pattern that we are a part of, the purpose for which we will serve, can be and will be revealed to us. Until then, we trust the knitter. Lesson number 2, and this leads lesson 1 to lesson 2, which is patience. That is a difficult lesson. Patience is the seed of blessing. A simple, ordinary sock, just like the ones that some of you are wearing right now, is made of about 17,000 knitted stitches. One sock. A pair, of course, that's 34,000 knitted stitches. Small acts of faith do indeed add up to great things. But so often it feels as if what we do, our little acts, they do not matter. But that way of thinking, it betrays the power and possibility of patience, the power of endurance, the power of commitment. Knitting teaches us that power. Knitting affords us the opportunity to practice patience until patience becomes a habit, valued and available for all of our non-yarn knitting needs. That is, when we knit together communities and friendships. A shawl is actually an outward symbol of an inner spiritual patience. Lesson number 3. Although we differ from one another in size, in shape, in viewpoint, some may be knitted stitches, some purl stitches, some seed or double or garter stitches, but no matter what we are, what our size, no matter how far apart we may be on the spectrum of the shawl, one end or the other, still, we are all connected. Still, every stitch is part of one another, part of the whole. And that connection is, in fact, a blessing. Without that connection, those individual stitches, they wouldn't exist. And yet the bond that connects us, which is a blessing, which is a lifeline, sometimes, you know as well as I do, it feels like an unwanted shackle. And sometimes we get tangled up in knots. And when that happens, a knitter knows this, that the harder one pulls, the more aggressive one gets with that tangled yarn, the worse the knot becomes. It is the same when our relationships get knotted and tangled. All of knitting is an exercise in patience, but in times of entanglement, knitting teaches us that is when an even greater patience than usual is needed. So that rather by pulling ever tighter in opposition, which only makes things worse, the best action, the most healing action, the only action that will allow us to continue to create something warm and blessing and healing is to loosen up a little bit. Just loosen up. That is accomplished by moving each piece of tangled yarn closer together. That is how you unknot something that's knotted. You have to move those pieces closer together to get enough slack to be able to pull it loose. That is how knots are tangled. That is how tangled relationships are resolved. Lesson number 4, a drop stitch. I know this very well by experience. A drop stitch always leaves a hole right there in the middle of a shawl. A drop stitch, if you do not know what that is, a drop stitch is a stitch that by error or inattention or distraction or lack of care falls off the knitting needle. If that drop stitch is not recovered, if you just keep going knitting as if nothing happened, if it is not reincorporated into the shawl, that drop stitch becomes a glaring and growing hole, which in time will lead to the unraveling of the entire shawl. A drop stitch is knitting's proof of what Paul writes in Corinthians, that if one part of the body suffers, eventually the whole body suffers together. Lesson number 5, don't pull on that loose thread. My mother used to tell me that. Don't pull on that loose thread, because she already knew what I've learned in the knitting group, that destruction is easier than creation. If you have a loose thread, and because that thread connects everything together, when you pull on the loose thread, all of a sudden, 2 weeks' work, 2 months' work, 400 stitches, 4,000 stitches become unraveled in a matter of seconds. Of seconds. Destruction is easy. Creation, building up, crafting communities of healing is hard. It takes time. But that is the holy work that God calls us to do. In Deuteronomy, God says, I have set before you the ways of life and prosperity and the ways of death and destruction. Choose the ways of life, God implores. Those ways are love, joy, patience, gentleness, welcome, peace, justice. The ways of destruction and death that God has placed before us are hate, they're greed, jealousy, judgment, gossip, revenge. Knitting, as it creates beauty, as it provides warmth and comfort, as it offers healing and shares love, is the practice of choosing the ways of life over and over again. Lastly, lesson 6. Knitting is an act of creation, and in creating, we ourselves change. Scientists report that knitting's repetitive motion creates the same benefits as meditation. Knitting slows cognitive decline by stimulating the brain. Knitting lowers blood pressure. It reduces anxiety and stress and depression. Knitting heals the knitter, even as the knitter offers healing to the one who will receive the shawl. In creating, the knitter is creating, is molded closer into the very image of God, the knitter Almighty. So everyone knits. Everyone. Certainly every person of faith, for we are called to weave together the fabric of God's kingdom here on earth. And so in that knitting, if you would like support, if you would like practice, we meet every Wednesday at 11 o'clock over at the church offices. Yes, there. We do offer knitting, but as you've heard, we offer so much more than that. We offer life. We offer laughter and beauty. So come to heal and be healed. And the use of yarn is optional. Amen.